Will you join with me in prayer? May these words that I speak be grounded in my soul, encouraged by the God presence in me. And may these words that you hear be captured by your soul and enlivened by the God presence in you. Amen. This is the second of three sermons that I want to preach on the Axial Age. This is Axial Age number 2. I said last week that the Axial Age, about 500 years before Christ, was a time when all over the world, Jeremiah and the prophets in Israel, Socrates and the teachers, the philosophers in Greece, Confucius, and a bunch of ethicists in China, Buddha in India, all over the world, people were teaching a new kind of teaching, which was based on caring and building compassion. And I didn't say last week, but it's also true that in India, and probably this is one of the most significant things to me, is that in India, Hinduism had lasted for a long, long time, but around 500 BCE, all of the Hindu religion was kind of turned upside down. Up to that point, the primary gods of the Hindu faith had been the gods of destruction and of war. And around 500, all of a sudden, the god of love and of caring became the primary god. So all over the world, spontaneously, there was this rising up of a new vision of what life would be like. I heard last week some challenges to some of the facts in my sermon, and that doesn't surprise me because I do tend to get carried away and speak in superlatives. So some of the claims I am making might have been a little stronger than the actual reality, but nobody challenged me on what I had to say. The thought that around 500 BCE, that the Axial Age was a time when the world turned on its axis, a time of shifting away from localized and self-centered concerns and toward a vision of all of humanity acting in a compassionate and caring way. I was surprised that nobody challenged me on the basic premise, because after all, when you think about it, did human community actually shift? Did humans all of a sudden start acting in a compassionate and caring way? After all, soon after he made his prophetic pronouncements, Jeremiah, who was the prophet I talked about last week, was carried off into exile in Egypt, where he died and simply disappeared from the pages of history. And Socrates, the Greek philosopher that I talked about, was forced to commit suicide by drinking poison. Two of the men who were advocating for compassion were not treated compassionately. I want to say this morning that really the reality was that what was born into the world in 500 BCE was an idea or a vision of compassionate caring. And there were many people who got it and who began to understand it and try to live it. There was more compassion in the world as people followed those teachings that they heard. But there were many other people who didn't get it and who carried on with life as if nothing had changed. And there were the ones who were in control of the world at that time who actively resisted those new ideas and visions. People who put Socrates to death. They wanted the world to be the same as it always was, a world that they could control. And that's the way humanity seems to respond to change. Some embrace it, some ignore it, some resist it. Whatever change happens to humanity, that's the way it seems to be met. But now I want to move on 500 years from the time of Jesus, from the time of the BCE, from the time of the Axial Age to the time of Jesus. I said last week at the end of the sermon that it's always bothered me that Jesus was not part of this Axial Age movement, given that we look to Jesus who changed the world for us Christians. If this Axial Age was God's work, why wasn't Jesus made a part of it? And I said that last week that I kind of think I have it figured out, at least for myself, and I want to share that with you today. But I want to begin by turning to a book called The Great Emergence, How Christianity is Changing and Why. It was published in 2008, and the author, Phyllis Tickle, makes the claim that every 500 years, the empowered structures of institutionalized Christianity go through a great upheaval, out of which new renewal and new growth comes. Let me say that again. Every 500 years, the empowered structures of Christianity go through a great upheaval, and a great renewal and growth appears. She's not making that as a theological statement. She's just looking at history and saying this is how she sees it. If you look at where we are today and go 500 years back from now, that was the time of the Reformation, when the church structure was really challenged, and the Reformed churches grew out of that, and Roman Catholicism itself reformed as a result of that. If you go back 500 years from the Reformation, you come to the time of the Great Schism, when Roman Catholicism and the Eastern Church separated from each other. So she looks at these periods and identifies times when these changes occurs. And she says that always out of these changes comes new expressions of faith, a revitalization of the old expressions of faith, and that the faith spreads and grows as a result of this renewal. So if this is a valid reading of history, then it reaches back before the beginning of Christianity, because as I said, Jesus comes 500 years after the great movement of the Axial Age, at least in the Hebrew tradition. And as I look at the life and teachings of Jesus, the thing that strikes me is that he got it. He knew what they were talking about. When they talked about compassion, compassionate, caring community, many people didn't get it, but Jesus did get it. Not only did he get it, but he was able to live it and articulate it in ways that people could understand. Suddenly, as he talked about what compassionate, caring community was like, they understood what he was saying. There are many things that can be and have been said about Jesus, about his life and his ministry. And I'm not trying to reduce all of those sayings and actions into this one idea. But I think it is fair to argue that Jesus saw the vision of what the world could be like if people lived with compassion and caring for each other. Not only did he see the vision, but he began to teach it and to live it in ways that people could understand. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus told his followers that this was the way that humans were meant to interact with each other. And in a small way, they began to get it too. They began to understand what he was saying. He lived his life according to the vision that was so clear to him, and his followers began to see what life could be like if they lived according to that vision. It was a great contrast to the predominant society of their day, the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, the predominant feature was the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And that was established by war and conquest, and by the enslavement of the conquered people. The officials, those who were in charge, said, this is the way it is in the world. This is the way in which the world is meant to be. And that was the best that they could hope for. But Jesus began to offer them a different vision, a different way, a better way. And they began to flock to it. As you look through the pages of Scripture, he was overwhelmed by crowds who wanted to hear what he was saying and were looking for ways of living it out. And as with all new ideas and visions, there were those who got it and tried to live by it. And there was those who continued their lives as if nothing new had happened and the world was as it was meant to be. And there were those with vested interests in the world as it was and who actively resisted these new ideas. Those were the people who were responsible for Jesus' death. They didn't want his ideas to catch on. But the new ideas did catch on. It gave people hope who had been living lives without hope. People had flocked to Jesus in this new way throughout his life. But after his death, they really catch on to what he's saying, and the faith begins to grow rapidly. And it is almost beyond understanding that the faith grew so rapidly, because when those who were in power caught on to what was happening, they persecuted and martyred those who were trying to follow this new way. And still, the new converts flocked in. And then this movement began to change. A way that had been built on caring and compassion became the official religion of the empire. And it began to show the attributes of the Roman way of power and control. What do I think happened? Well, the Roman Empire was so successful in its tyranny because the conquering legions, those armies who fought and conquered new lands, were also engineers who were adept at building new roads. And wherever they conquered a new land, the first thing they did was they built all-weather roads, so that all parts of the empire were accessible at any kind of weather, at any time of the year. If you wanted to foment a rebellion in the Roman Empire, you knew just how long you had to make a success of it. You had the time that it took for one rider to get from wherever you were fomenting the rebellion to the nearest legion garrison, and then for the legionnaires to get from that garrison back to the place where you were fomenting the rebellion. If you weren't successful by the time they got there, then they obliterated you. They killed every man, woman, and child who was part of that rebellion. But if the rebellion was one that challenged the world view and the religion of Rome, if it was a rebellion for people's minds and hearts, and it wasn't a physical rebellion, then the Romans dealt with it in a different way. They killed off the leaders of the movement, put them to death, and they felt that once the leaders were gone, the whole rebellion would just disintegrate. It would fall under its own weight. And it makes sense, doesn't it? And it also, you begin to see, was the way in which they dealt with Christianity, by killing off the leaders and expecting that the rebellion would just slowly die. But it didn't. The faith community continued to grow. And by the time the Romans discovered that their way of dealing with the rebellion wasn't working, it was already too big for them to deal with. The community had already grown too large for them to destroy. And so what did they do? They co-opted it. They made this Christian religion, this new religion, the religion of the empire. The Emperor Constantine, it became the official religion of the empire. and they turned Christianity into the imperial religion. And the leadership was given a choice of either continuing the rebellion, continuing to be that group of people who worked against the empire, and when they did that they faced prosecution and martyrdom, or they became the leaders of the imperial religion of Rome, with all the power and pomp that brought. And I can imagine that if I was caught in that situation where I could either choose martyrdom and persecution or power and pomp, I think I could become very pompous very easily. It wasn't an either-or choice. I mean, the caring and compassionate way of Jesus were still practiced in the church. But it was also the conquering and controlling way of Rome that appeared in the church. Those two views of church were kind of intermingled and intertwined. Or sometimes they existed separately and independently of each other. But it's almost as if there were two Christianities, the imperial religion and that humble, caring community that Jesus had taught and lived. And sometimes there seemed to be little connection between the faith that Jesus taught and lived and the religion that his followers were practicing. And so the focus of the Axial age was again clouded. But I want to suggest that there are ways in which it seems to be appearing again in our day and age. And that will be the topic of my third and last talk next Sunday.